1942, the Solomon Sea. Night covers the ocean like ink. The engines of a Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bomber hum steadily as the crew scans the darkness below. Their orders are clear: hunt down American convoys supplying the newly established base on Guadalcanal. The pilot leans forward, eyes straining through the green haze of his gun sight. He believes surprise is on his side. The Americans, he thinks, are blind in the dark. But hundreds of miles away, inside a small wooden shack on a remote Pacific island, a U.S. radar operator sits in front of a flickering oscilloscope. A faint blip appears, then another. Within seconds, the silhouettes of incoming aircraft begin to form, not on the horizon but on the green pulse of his radar screen. Phones ring, switchboards light up. Within minutes, Marine F-4F Wildcats roar into the night sky, guided not by sight but by invisible radio waves bouncing through the tropical air. As the Japanese formation closes in, their pilots still think they're the hunters. They don't know the Americans already see them coming. In the darkness above the Pacific, the age of technological warfare has quietly begun, and Japan is about to fly straight into its first invisible trap. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it seemed the Pacific had turned into a Japanese lake. In just 6 months, imperial forces stretched from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Solomon Islands. Their air fleets, skilled and disciplined, had crushed nearly every opponent. The Zero fighter dominated the skies, and Japanese bombers struck with unnerving precision. Surprise was their greatest weapon, and it appeared endless. The United States, reeling from the losses at Pearl Harbor, faced a brutal question: how do you fight an enemy you can't see coming? The answer began quietly in the strange language of electricity and echo. Before the war, radar was an experimental curiosity. A few scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory, along with British counterparts at BODSI and later the Chain Home Network, had proven that radio waves could detect aircraft long before the human eye could. But in America's pre-war mindset, radar was still a laboratory toy, something for peacetime research, not battlefield command. Pearl Harbor changed everything. In the aftermath of the attack, the U.S. military discovered that radar had, in fact, detected the incoming Japanese planes on December 7th. 2 young operators at Oahu's Opana station had seen a cluster of blips approaching from the north, larger than any they'd seen before. They reported it. Their superiors dismissed it, believing it was a flight of B-17s expected from the mainland. Within an hour, bombs were falling on Battleship Row. That failure, a failure of recognition, not technology, haunted U.S. commanders. It also became the seed of a new doctrine: radar would no longer be ignored. By early 1942, radar units were being rushed to the Pacific. The U.S. Signal Corps deployed the SCR-270, a mobile radar system capable of detecting aircraft up to 150 miles away. It wasn't perfect. It required large antenna arrays and skilled operators, and it often struggled with humidity and terrain. But it worked, and that mattered more than anything. The first stations went up in Hawaii, Australia, and the scattered islands that dotted the Pacific supply routes. Each outpost became a silent guardian: a wooden shack, a generator, a spinning antenna, and a few men trained to read the flickering traces on a phosphor screen. Radar could now see beyond the horizon. The Japanese couldn't. At the time, Japan had invested little in radar development. Their early systems were crude, limited in range and precision. Worse, Japanese doctrine still relied on human eyesight and intuition, the skill of pilots, not the science of detection. They saw warfare as an art of courage and surprise. The Americans were turning it into a science of prediction. By the time U.S. forces began landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942, radar had started to reshape the air war. American ships carried the new SC and CXM sets, which could pick up approaching aircraft while they were still miles away. Land-based radar stations tracked night raids and relayed information to fighter squadrons through radio networks. The Japanese didn't yet understand how their ambushes kept failing. Their pilots reported mysterious interceptions, American fighters appearing in total darkness, attacking with uncanny timing. It wasn't luck. It was the pulse of a hidden revolution, a revolution powered by invisible waves. And in those crucial months of 1942, that revolution began turning the tide of the Pacific. Across the vast Pacific, the American radar network grew like a silent spiderweb. From the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Chain, small detachments of engineers and radio operators worked in secrecy to build what would become the first modern air warning system. They called it the Aircraft Warning Service, a network of outposts that detected incoming raids, identified flight paths, and guided defensive squadrons to intercept. Every radar blip meant lives saved, ships spared, and time gained. The system wasn't born from luxury or comfort. These stations were built in jungle humidity, on coral atolls, or atop volcanic ridges where the horizon stretched endlessly over the sea. Operators lived in tents or shacks, swatting insects while monitoring glowing cathode screens deep into the night. Many were teenagers, drafted radio enthusiasts who had learned radar theory only months earlier. Yet their calm discipline turned chaos into control. By late 1942, the technology itself had evolved. The SCR-270, the same model that had detected the Pearl Harbor attack, was now joined by smaller, faster systems like the SCR-527 and SCR-602. These newer radars could be deployed with frontline troops, carried by trucks or crated for quick assembly on captured islands. For the first time in military history, the United States could build an electronic wall across open ocean. Each radar station linked through radio to a command post, sometimes on a nearby island, sometimes aboard a carrier task force. Radar blips were plotted on transparent boards, forming a living map of the sky. Intercept officers calculated altitudes, bearings, and speeds. When an incoming formation appeared, alerts rippled outward to anti-aircraft batteries, ship captains, and airfield commanders. The result was coordination. And coordination was something the Japanese had never expected from an enemy, spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Japan's own radar development, though not non-existent, lagged behind. Their engineers had begun experimenting with early warning systems like the Type A and Type B sets, but these were limited in both range and accuracy. Worse, the Japanese High Command underestimated radar's importance, viewing it as a supplementary tool rather than a decisive weapon. Cultural perception played a part. Japanese military tradition valued intuition, instinct, and martial spirit, the human factor over mechanical advantage. The idea that machines could see the enemy before a pilot did seemed cold, impersonal, even dishonorable. In contrast, American commanders embraced radar with pragmatic urgency. To them, war wasn't about honor. It was about survival and efficiency. By the time radar stations dotted the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the Japanese intelligence network had begun to notice their presence. Reconnaissance photos showed strange rotating antennas and tall masts near American bases. Reports filtered back to Tokyo, but few officers grasped what those strange machines actually did, or how devastating their effects would soon become. In late 1942, U.S. Marine and Navy intercept squadrons began to receive orders directly from radar controllers. Instead of waiting for visual confirmation, pilots were guided by voice commands. Enemy approaching, bearing 230, altitude 10,000. It was the birth of ground-controlled interception, a concept that would define air defense for decades. Now, Japanese bomber formations that once attacked undetected found themselves hunted in darkness. American fighters were airborne before the bombers even reached their targets. Night after night, raids failed, confusion spread, and the once invincible Japanese aerial force began to realize something unseen was turning their precision into chaos. What they didn't know was that this unseen hand was spreading, an invisible shield growing, stronger with every island the U.S. captured. And behind that shield stood a handful of young men, watching glowing screens, tracking the war one blip at a time. In the early stages of radar warfare, the heroes were not always in cockpits or on bridges. They were in small wooden huts scattered across the Pacific, where silence was broken only by the hum of a generator and the faint buzz of a cathode ray tube. Most radar operators were barely out of high school. They had been trained in hurried programs by the Signal Corps, taught to read electronic echoes as though deciphering the pulse of the ocean itself. They worked in rotating shifts, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch, staring at flickering green screens until their eyes burned. The work demanded patience. A false alarm could scramble fighters and waste precious fuel. A missed blip could cost hundreds of lives. Yet these young men, isolated, forgotten, often unrecognized, became the hidden sentinels of the Pacific War. In places like Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Espiritu Santo, their lives followed a strange rhythm. coconut palms outside, mosquito nets over their bunks, sweat on their necks as they logged every contact in notebooks already damp from the humidity. Their reward was knowing that every blip they spotted gave someone else a chance to live. These were the first soldiers to fight with machines instead of rifles, guardians of an invisible front line that never slept. Radar, or radio detection and ranging, worked on a principle simple in theory, brilliant in application. Radio waves were sent outward, bounced off an object, and returned to the receiver. By measuring the time delay and signal strength, operators could detect range, direction, and even altitude. But the genius of wartime radar wasn't only in discovery, it was in adaptation. American scientists learned to refine signal clarity by using shorter wavelengths and better amplifiers. New transmitters allowed for detection of smaller, faster targets. As the war expanded, engineers built radar systems for almost every platform, from carrier decks to destroyers, from airfields to remote jungle ridges. The SCR-270, tall and clumsy though it was, became a symbol of progress. Its antenna could sweep the horizon 360 degrees, catching aircraft long before the naked eye could see them. Later systems like the SCR-527 and SCR-602 were lighter and mobile, perfect for the island-hopping campaigns that followed. Each improvement meant fewer surprises, and for the Japanese, fewer victories. For the first time, warfare wasn't decided by who saw first with their eyes, but who saw first with their instruments. It marked the shift from bravery-driven combat to data-driven command. And that shift would prove devastating for an empire that had built its air power on instinct and audacity. Japanese pilots entered the war with unmatched confidence. The Zero fighter was light, agile, and lethal. Their bombing formations had perfected coordinated strikes over China and the Philippines. Their early raids from Pearl Harbor to Darwin succeeded through surprise and timing, but radar quietly removed both. At first, the Japanese didn't realize it. They assumed their failed raids were due to improved U.S. patrols or coincidence. When American fighters began appearing at night or in fog, some pilots reported seeing phantom patrols, enemy aircraft arriving from nowhere. In truth, these phantoms were guided by radar. By mid-1942, Japanese aircrews noticed something unsettling. Each time they attempted to attack an island or carrier group, American defenders were already airborne. Anti-aircraft guns were aligned before the bombers came into view. Ambushes turned into desperate retreats. Japanese intelligence tried to understand. Reports described radio detection equipment at American bases, but senior commanders dismissed its importance. Many in Tokyo believed such technology couldn't possibly track fast-moving planes across open water. The Japanese Imperial Navy, steeped in tradition and superstition, put faith in human vision and spiritual willpower, traits radar didn't respect. The result was strategic blindness. While American radar operators calmly plotted incoming raids, Japanese pilots flew into traps they couldn't see. Their greatest strength, disciplined aggression, had become a liability. Every mission carried a hidden risk. The enemy already knew they were coming. In a war that stretched across the world's largest ocean, radar was rewriting the rules of visibility. And soon it would do far more than detect aircraft. It would control the very rhythm of the Pacific War. Once radar began feeding data directly into air defense centers, the U.S. no longer reacted to Japanese raids. It orchestrated their destruction. In places like Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal, radar readings were relayed to command posts where plotting boards displayed real-time enemy movements. Controllers tracked the formation, vectoring fighter squadrons into ideal attack positions before the Japanese ever saw them. This was a revolution in coordination. A radar blip meant more than just a warning. It meant control. Pilots who once relied on chance now followed calm, precise voices guiding them through headsets. Turn 2 degrees south. Climb to 10,000. Contact in 60 seconds. Those voices belonged to ground controllers who never left their wooden huts, yet they shaped the outcome of entire battles. Radar also transformed anti-aircraft defense. Guns that once fired blindly into the night could now be synchronized with radar-guided predictors, giving them timing and accuracy never before possible. Japanese bombers approaching at night faced walls of flak so precise it seemed pre-aimed. Their surprise attacks, once devastating and now ended in chaos and heavy loss. With each intercepted raid, radar expanded its reputation from a scientific curiosity to a battlefield weapon. By late 1943, American strategy no longer just used radar, it depended on it. Radar's success was not an accident. It was driven by leadership that believed technology could win wars. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood early that radar was more than an aid. It was a force multiplier. He ordered radar installations on every new ship that left American docks. Under his command, the U.S. Navy began integrating radar reports into tactical planning, from carrier defense to submarine hunting. At the same time, Admiral Ernest King and General Hap Arnold pushed radar into the Army Air Forces and coastal defenses. They invested in research, training, and rapid deployment, ensuring no major operation went without early warning. But leadership wasn't only about top brass. At the ground level, innovation came from officers who refused to wait for orders. Men like Colonel Gordon Saville and engineer Albert Taylor helped create the first radar-directed fighter control system in the Pacific. They saw what radar could do, and built doctrines around it before official policy even existed. Their foresight meant that by the time Japan realized radar's impact, the U.S. had already built a network that couldn't be undone. The Pacific War wasn't just a clash of nations, it was a collision of worldviews. Japanese military philosophy placed the human spirit above all else. The belief that courage, discipline, and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage had been central to its victories from China to the Philippines. A warrior's worth was measured by will, not by the tools he used. The Americans thought differently. Their confidence lay in production, innovation, and adaptation. They believed machines could extend human capability, that science itself was a weapon. This difference shaped everything. While the Japanese invested in elite pilot training and aggressive tactics, the United States invested in radar, communications, and logistics. One side looked inward, the other outward. By 1943, that philosophical gap had become fatal. Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight and intuition to find enemies over vast oceans. American pilots, by contrast, flew under the guidance of radar controllers who knew exactly where to send them. Every intercepted formation proved the same truth. Courage alone couldn't defeat mathematics. As the invisible radar beams swept across the night sky, they didn't just expose aircraft. They exposed an entire way of thinking, one that could no longer survive in a war increasingly defined by science. Radar had started as a defensive measure, a way to prevent another Pearl Harbor. But soon it would turn offensive. The Americans were about to use radar not just to see the enemy, but to hunt them in the dark. May 1942, the Coral Sea. For the first time in naval history, two opposing fleets fought without ever seeing each other. Aircraft, not ships, became the decisive instruments of war. And hidden beneath the surface of that transformation was radar. American carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown were fitted with the latest CXAM radar systems, experimental but functional. As Japanese strike groups approached from hundreds of miles away, their presence was detected not by lookouts with binoculars, but by electronic pulses bouncing invisibly through the sky. The reports from radar stations and carrier sets allowed American commanders to launch defensive patrols long before visual contact. It wasn't perfect. The U.S. still suffered heavy losses. But the battle marked a shift. The age of intuition was ending. From now on, detection would decide survival. A few months later came Guadalcanal, the true proving ground of radar in the Pacific. The island, seized by U.S. Marines in August 1942, became a magnet for Japanese air raids. Each night, bombers came from Rabaul, flying low and fast across the water. The Americans called them Washing Machine Charlie for their erratic engines and midnight timing. At first, every night attack sent the Marines scrambling blindly, firing into the dark. But then radar arrived. The SCR-270 and SCR-527 systems were installed on the island's high points, their rotating antennas scanning the skies beyond human sight. Within weeks, the difference was astonishing. The radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft nearly 100 miles away. Operators relayed bearings and altitude to the airfield at Henderson Field, where fighter pilots waited in darkness, engines idling. When the signal came, bandits inbound, bearing 210, altitude 9,000, they took off immediately, guided by radio to precise intercept points. The first successful radar-directed interception over Guadalcanal stunned both sides. Japanese bombers, expecting surprise, instead found wildcats waiting in their path, guns already aimed. The night sky lit up with tracer fire, Dozens of aircraft went down before reaching the island. For the Japanese, it was a mystery. For the Americans, it was confirmation. Radar worked. Every raid that followed turned into a grim repetition. Japanese crews flying hours through storm and darkness reached their targets only to be met by prepared defenders. Their carefully timed ambushes were now predictable patterns visible on radar screens. Reports from Japanese survivors spoke of disbelief. Some suspected American espionage, traitors in their own ranks. Others thought the U.S. used spirit detectors. Few could accept that machines could see what the eye could not. As the months passed, radar operators grew more confident, more precise. They began identifying formation sizes and even estimating aircraft types by signal strength. Commanders at Henderson Field started planning counterattacks using radar data. What began as a defensive advantage became a strategic tool, a way to dictate the rhythm of combat. On October 14, 1942, one of the largest Japanese raids of the campaign approached Guadalcanal. 2 waves of bombers escorted by fighters. American radar picked them up 115 miles out. Within minutes, every U.S. aircraft was airborne. Anti-aircraft batteries ready, searchlights positioned. The Japanese pilots never had a chance. Before they could align their bombing runs, they were swarmed by defending fighters. Dozens of planes were shot down or scattered into the sea. The rest dropped their bombs blindly and fled. That night, American officers realized something extraordinary. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, they had intercepted and defeated a major Japanese air operation before it reached them. The invisible wall had become real. After that, no Japanese raid on Guadalcanal succeeded. The skies that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to radar. But Guadalcanal was just the beginning. Across the Pacific, the same technology was spreading, from island to island, from ship to ship, until the Japanese found themselves fighting not just the enemy they could see, but the one they could never find. By 1943, radar had become more than a defensive advantage. It was the unseen backbone of American warfare. From carriers to island outposts, from submarines to night fighters, radar transformed how battles were fought and won. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the Solomon Islands campaign. The Japanese continued their night bombing runs, confident in their experience. Yet time and again, they were detected hundreds of miles before reaching target. The U.S. had built what pilots began to call the radar fence. Every new island captured meant another node in an expanding web of electromagnetic eyes. Then came the leap from detection to destruction. In 1943, the United States introduced the P-61 Black Widow, the world's first purpose-built night fighter. Equipped with its own onboard radar, the SCR-720, it could hunt independently, tracking bombers in complete darkness. No longer did radar exist only on the ground. It now flew through the night, guiding American pilots to enemies who believed they were hidden by the sky. The effect was immediate. Japanese air losses began to rise dramatically, especially during night raids over the Solomons, the Marianas, and New Guinea. Pilots who once used the clouds for concealment now found death waiting within them. Many never even saw the aircraft that shot them down. The Americans had entered the era of invisible combat. Naval warfare changed too. Radar-equipped ships like the USS Washington and USS South Dakota could now track enemy fleets and aircraft long before visual contact. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle in history, American radar systems detected Japanese aircraft over 150 miles out. Fighter directors vectored interceptors perfectly into their paths, resulting in what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was not arrogance. It was precision. Out of 373 attacking Japanese planes, more than 300 were destroyed. Radar had given American commanders near total control of the engagement. Japanese survivors described the experience as surreal. They were ambushed by unseen foes. Every maneuver, every approach seemed anticipated. What they didn't know was that radar screens aboard U.S. carriers showed their positions in real time, their fates sealed long before they entered visual range. By this point, Japan's radar efforts were years behind. Their scientists had managed to create a few primitive detection systems, the Type 21 and Type 23. But production was limited, performance weak, and deployment scattered. Without a unified command structure or industrial capacity to match the United States, Japan could never build the same network. Worse, their military culture still distrusted it. Many senior officers preferred to rely on samurai intuition and sharp eyesight rather than cold electronics. This mindset, noble but fatal, turned their air fleets into targets for a nation that had embraced modern warfare completely. In the night skies of 1944, the contrast was unmistakable. On one side, American radar-guided fighters, communication networks, and data coordination. On the other, Japanese pilots flying by instinct into carefully prepared kill zones. Even Japanese naval formations began to fall victim to radar-guided gunnery. American ships could now engage at night, directing heavy gunfire with radar accuracy. At the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, part of the Leyte Gulf operations, U.S. battleships used radar targeting to obliterate approaching Japanese forces in total darkness. The Japanese ships never even saw their attackers. The war had entered a new dimension, one where machines dictated visibility, timing, and death. By late 1944, American superiority in radar was absolute. Japanese air raids dwindled. Their reconnaissance aircraft could no longer approach undetected. Their carriers, deprived of trained pilots and blind to radar detection, became easy prey for American strikes. The shock within Japanese command circles was deep. Post-battle reports began acknowledging radar's decisive role, reluctantly too late. A secret Imperial Navy study concluded that American mastery of radar has rendered our surprise attacks impossible. Invisible, silent, and unstoppable radar had achieved what bombs and bullets alone could not. It stripped the enemy of initiative. In every major Pacific battle after 1943, radar dictated who saw, who fired, and who lived. The Japanese had underestimated it. The Americans had mastered it. And from that moment onward, the skies of the Pacific no longer belonged to the brave. They belonged to those who could see without sight. When the Pacific skies finally fell silent in 1945, radar had already reshaped the nature of warfare. The Japanese defeat was not only measured in ships sunk or planes shot down, it was measured in information. The side that could see first, decide faster, and strike accurately had won. Across the captured islands, American soldiers began uncovering fragments of Japanese radar installations, crude antennas, incomplete circuits, and technical manuals written in haste. Most were experimental or locally improvised. They showed effort, but also desperation. Japan had tried to close the technological gap, but by then the race was already over. In contrast, the Allied radar network now stretched across the Pacific like an electronic empire. From the Aleutians to Australia, hundreds of radar sites formed an invisible chain linking every base, ship, and aircraft. The war that had begun with surprise, Pearl Harbor, ended with the enemy losing the power to surprise entirely. Post-war analysis revealed how devastating this imbalance had been. At Guadalcanal, radar-directed interceptions increased American air-kill ratios from 1:1 to nearly 5:1. During the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, radar-guided bombers detected and destroyed a Japanese convoy before it could reach Leh, sinking 8 troop transports and 4 destroyers in a single operation. Each of these victories told the same story. Knowledge had become a weapon. For Japan, the consequences went beyond the battlefield. Their pilots had been trained for close combat, relying on sight, instinct, and courage. But radar removed those elements from modern war. It rewarded coordination over heroism, calculation over passion. It was in every sense a machine's kind of warfare. American crews, once fearful of night attacks, now operated with calm confidence. In radar-lit command rooms, officers no longer stared into the dark waiting for the enemy. They watched glowing traces move across screens, predicting enemy actions before they happened. One veteran radar operator from the USS Enterprise later recalled, "It was like playing chess in the dark, except we had a flashlight, and they didn't." This shift in visibility redefined military thinking. After 1943, almost every major U.S. naval engagement relied on radar coordination. Fighter control officers guided interceptors over radio. Destroyers picked up incoming torpedoes early, and entire fleets maneuvered through fog and night as if it were daylight. Japan's inability to counter this technology left them fighting a war they could no longer see. Even when intelligence reports reached Tokyo describing radar's effects, there was little the industry could do. Strategic bombing, resource shortages, and poor coordination crippled their ability to produce advanced electronics. In desperation, Japanese scientists explored countermeasures. Chaff like Fu, deception foil, and radar detectors, but these projects came too late and in too few numbers. The Allied radar web remained unbroken. By war's end, U.S. engineers had already moved to a new frontier: microwave radar. The British invention of the cavity magnetron had given Allied radar far greater precision and range, small enough to fit inside aircraft yet powerful enough to detect periscopes at sea. Japan, still experimenting with outdated meter-wave designs, was left decades behind. When Japanese officers surrendered their final outposts in 1945, some expressed disbelief at how completely radar had changed the balance. A post-surrender report by the Imperial Navy admitted that radar had robbed us of the night and blinded us by day. The Pacific War had begun with Japan's mastery of surprise, the unannounced strike on Pearl Harbor. It ended with that power stripped away not by numbers alone, but by invisible waves of energy sweeping through air and sea. Radar had quietly rewritten the rules of war. In the months following Japan's surrender, U.S. intelligence officers began a quiet investigation into how radar had influenced the course of the war. What they found confirmed what many frontline veterans already knew. Radar had not only saved lives, it had shortened the war itself. Declassified post-war reports revealed that by mid-1944, radar had contributed to reducing Allied losses in the Pacific by over 60% compared to early campaigns. Carrier task forces that once relied on spotters and lookouts were now shielded by concentric rings of radar coverage, detecting enemy aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Every minute gained through early detection meant fighters were already climbing before bombers appeared on the horizon. Even ground battles changed. On islands like Saipan and Leyte, portable radar units helped direct naval gunfire with uncanny precision. Ships miles offshore could hit Japanese positions hidden deep in jungle terrain, guided by radar coordinates and aerial spotting. The result was overwhelming. Firepower no longer depended on visibility. Japanese prisoners of war often spoke of their confusion and disbelief. Many described how night raids once considered safe became suicide missions. Others recalled approaching what they believed were undefended convoys, only to find interceptors waiting, perfectly positioned, as if forewarned. One captured pilot from the Yokosuka Air Group reportedly told interrogators, "We used to own the night, then somehow the Americans took it from us." That somehow was radar. For the U.S. military, radar was more than a wartime tool. It became the foundation of a new military philosophy. In Washington, the success of radar-guided warfare pushed defense planners to invest heavily in peacetime research. Laboratories that once operated under wartime secrecy, MIT's Radiation Laboratory, Bell Labs, and the Naval Research Laboratory, continued their work, leading directly to innovations in early computers, guided missiles, and the Cold War's global early warning systems. The same technology that had turned Japanese ambushes into traps would soon detect Soviet bombers and eventually intercontinental missiles. Yet amid the triumph, there was a quiet recognition of how fragile the balance of innovation had been. Had Japan recognized radar's potential sooner? Had they invested in electronic warfare with the same intensity they gave to naval aviation? The Pacific might have looked very different. A few senior Japanese engineers interviewed after the war admitted as much. "We were too proud of our eyes," one lamented, "and too late to trust the machine." Meanwhile, in the U.S. thousands of young radar operators returned home as unsung veterans. Many had never fired a shot in combat, yet their silent vigilance had protected fleets and cities alike. The radar rooms, filled with hum and static, had been the hidden front line of the Pacific. As occupation forces entered Japan, American officers documented every surviving radar set, transmitter, and notebook. They discovered prototypes of airborne radar, experimental detection systems, and even early warning sites near Tokyo Bay. But all of it was incomplete, fragments of a race already lost. By 1946, radar had entered the public imagination. The once secret word appeared in newspapers and films, described as the eye that never sleeps. It symbolized the modern age. Invisible power, precise and relentless. For those who had lived through the Pacific War, radar represented more than victory. It was the moment technology eclipsed instinct. The world had witnessed the First War decided not by who fired first, but by who knew first. And as the U.S. Navy ships steamed home beneath calm Pacific skies, The spinning antennas atop their decks kept turning, a reminder of how invisible waves had changed the world forever. In the end, radar didn't roar like a bomber or flash like artillery. It whispered. It whispered through static and signal, through the quiet hum of a machine that changed how humans understood war. For the United States, radar was more than a technological triumph. It was proof that intellect could overpower instinct. The Pacific had once seemed too vast, too unknowable. Yet through discipline, engineering, and cooperation, the Americans learned to see what had always been invisible. The Japanese pilots who once believed in speed, surprise, and courage as the supreme weapons found themselves facing something they could neither outfly nor outfight: foresight. Their courage never faded, but it was defeated by precision. Every spinning radar dish across the Pacific symbolized a shift in warfare itself, from human reaction to technological prediction. The age of radar was the age of awareness. Battles were no longer decided by who saw the enemy first, but by who could see without sight at all. That invisible shield built over the Pacific did more than protect ships and cities. It marked the beginning of a new world, a world where wars would be fought by signals and sensors, where unseen intelligence would decide the fate of nations. From those lonely outposts on coral islands to the command decks of mighty carriers, radar operators carried the burden of an entire front. Their vigilance turned the tide of war. Their technology turned chaos into order. And as the Pacific fell quiet, one truth stood clear. Japan's pilots had underestimated radar, and in doing so, they underestimated the future itself.